Today we're exploring Ellivere of the Wild Court, a brand new commander out of the Wilds of Eldraine commander deck, Virtue and Valor. We're going to check out some of the best cards we could put in this deck, whether we're upgrading it or building it from scratch. For 2 green-white, Ellivere is a 4/4 legendary human knight. Whenever Ellivere of the Wild Court enters the battlefield or attacks, create a virtuous roll token attached to another target creature you control. If you control another roll on it, put that one into the graveyard. Enchanted creature gets +1/+1 for each enchantment you control. And whenever an enchanted creature you control deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. This seems like a lot of fun to build, and probably pretty good too. Once this deck gets going, our creatures are going to get really big off of those roll tokens, and we could be drawing a ton of cards. The first batch of cards we're going to consider are kind of like the roll tokens, in that they make enchanted creature bigger based on how many enchantments are on the battlefield. Those first 3 are nice low mana options for souping our creatures up, but Sage's Revelry could draw us just a ton of cards when it comes down. And Mantle of the Ancients returns any number of target aura and or equipment cards from our graveyard to the battlefield. That seems like a very strong late game play. Now, it's important for an Ellivere deck to be getting in combat damage somehow, because we want to make the most of the card draw ability. And there's 2 ways we can do that, and we kind of got to pick which one we're doing as we're building. Either we make our creatures hard to block because of the auras we put on them, or the creatures in our deck are just getting in damage on their own, and the auras just soup them up. If the latter is our strategy, then obviously any creatures with flying or trample would help with that, and creatures that can't be blocked, although that's not really a thing in green-white. We do have a bunch of options with Shadow though, that's basically unblockable. A deck like this would both want auras that make our creature very big, and auras that do something when they deal damage to a player. But we might be better off making our creatures hard to block based off the enchantments we put on them. And if that's the direction we're going, then obviously enchantments that give flying would be good, or trample, especially if it gives a real big power and toughness boost. Indrik, Umbra, and Lure both say all creatures able to block enchanted creature do so. Essentially, then your other attacking creatures are unblockable. I'm not sure this is the best way to go about it, but it still could be good. Protection can essentially make a creature unblockable, and as an added bonus, it makes them really good blockers too. And Canopy Cover, enchanted creature can't be blocked except by creatures with flying or reach, and enchanted creature can't be the target of spells or abilities your opponents control. That's a nice way to protect your creatures, and while we're talking about that, Totem Armor is always a great option too. But my favorite options for a deck like this are cards that offer some kind of card advantage. We've got a few options for enchantments that go back to your hand when the creature dies or the enchantment goes to the graveyard, or that you can recast from the graveyard in one way or another, and a bunch of options that draw us a card when they enter the battlefield. Mostly, these are not overpowered cards themselves. Their power comes from us being able to draw into even more enchantments to make the most of those roll tokens. And while we're talking about card draw, let's take a look at the Enchantress effects we have. This batch is good in basically any enchantment-based deck. Draw a card whenever you cast an enchantment, but these next few are the really good ones. These ones are must-haves for this deck. That's because the card draw is an enter the battlefield trigger instead of a cast trigger. That means the roll tokens trigger the draw. I want to mention Femeref Enchantress here too. Whenever an enchantment is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, draw a card. This may not normally make the cut in an enchantment deck, but it can draw you cards off of rolls going to the graveyard. You can even put a roll onto a creature that already has a roll, which will put one of them into the graveyard, triggering the draw. I don't know if that makes this card worth putting into the deck, but worth consideration. Similar to some of the cards that draw when an enchantment enters the battlefield, really any card with Constellation is worth considering, because enchantment tokens trigger Constellation too. Undo Spirit Dancer does not technically have Constellation, but it's close. Whenever an enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, you may create a token that's a copy of it. Do this only once a turn. And this seems especially good if your deck has a lot of the cantrips, a lot of the, when they enter the battlefield, draw enchantments. Next, we have various cards that search our library for an enchantment, or in some cases an aura, and puts it into our hand. There's also a couple options that search an aura and put it straight out onto the battlefield. The high mana cost ones might be a little iffy. It depends on what kind of auras are in your deck. If you can go get like an Eldrazi conscription, well, then it could be pretty good. For ramp, we have a bunch of options that reduce the cost of enchantments we cast. Also, enchant land auras would be really good in this deck because they trigger our Enchantress effects, and also Constellation. Courser of Krufix allows us to play lands from the top of our library, and Dryad of the Elysian Grove lets us play an additional land every turn and color fixes us, while also being enchantment creatures that trigger all sorts of stuff in the deck. Then Sanctum Weaver and Sarah's Sanctum, which both tap for mana equal to the number of enchantments we control. Fair warning though, Sarah's Sanctum is like a $250 card. Speaking of cards that count the number of enchantments we control, Sphere of Safety says creatures can't attack you or planeswalker you control unless their controller pays X for each of those creatures, where X is the number of enchantments you control. And Destiny Spinner, creature and enchantment spells you control can't be countered and pay 3 and a green. Target land you control becomes an XX elemental creature with trample and haste until end of turn, where X is the number of enchantments you control. Also, there's a bunch of creatures that just get bigger with each enchantment on the battlefield, and some that get bigger based on how many auras are on them specifically. It might be nice to have 1 or 2 cards in the deck that return enchantments from the graveyard to the battlefield. For removal, we could focus on pacifism-like cards that stop creatures from attacking or blocking, or enchantments that turn our opponent's stuff into useless stuff. Oblivion Ring effects might be good too. For board wipes, Winds of Wrath is obviously the choice here. The downside is, if we went with auras for removal like we just talked about, some of their stuff is not gonna die. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video or if it was helpful to you, consider hitting that like button. That helps me out a ton. And if I missed any good ones, let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.